I've been working on a book, and this is the summary of the first part of the book. I'm reading it out because some people prefer that, and the actual book will be distributed to almost nobody in the nature of things, while on the other hand, something online, such as this recording, might have one or two listeners. The nature of the book will be clear immediately. The first part of this book has concerned itself with asking and trying to let us know what's wrong with Britain. I've avoided spelling out its problems as I see them around us, but the problem as a whole is obvious. Nobody cares for the nation. Nobody seems to know what it is or what it was. In the category of nobody, I include everyone, all the classes, all occupations, every soul. Our hopeless spirit is embodied in a people who are complacent about the nation's death, and in a leadership or elite class whose stated aim is to join our country to something else and then to forget about it. When they are asked what Britain is for them, they talk about economic problems and economic solutions, like slaves would. The people do not reproduce and have no natural leadership because they have no beliefs which a leader could express for them so as to lead them from a real past to a future. That is, the problem of Britain is a philosophical one, and it needs a philosophical answer. To what purpose, anyway? Why lament the death of Britain? As I've said, the nature of British people is that they are liberals by politics and individualists by nature. How can such a people have any interest in a country or a nation? Why should they concern themselves if their nation is dead? At least one would assume each of the individuals is alive, and isn't that enough? My premise at the start was that there will be a civil war. Individuals with any history of friendship, forced to live cheek by jowl with their cultural enemies because of their own vices, will eventually resort to forcing each other out of the country. That's a given. The only remaining question is, apart from the mere survival on an individual basis, why the British should try to win the civil war in their country. That's another philosophical question. It goes as follows. Individual liberal people noticed that they lost their liberty due to the chaotic invasion of the place they live in by an almost infinite number of economic migrants and straight-up criminals and enemies. They will lose their liberty, although liberty was essential to the character and happiness of individuals and liberals. That's how the trouble brews and turns into civil war. Because Britain has been made into an economic zone rather than a home, a place where strangers could live peacefully side by side, conscious of their right to be there. So the trouble starts. These days, a large number of people in Britain do not consider this to be a home, and therefore the state has had to restrict liberty to the individual in order to prevent anger from becoming violence and insurrection. I would say that civil war is inevitable because the government is now only interested in maintaining peace among people who dislike each other, like a totalitarian state governing an artificial nation would do. At the moment, the people, they know something is being lost, but they don't know what. They don't have to know. It's not hard. They're losing their inheritance, and they are losing their future. They're losing their property above all. You could ask, what will historians of Britain in future say when they look back on it and describe how we live now? In some future different world, what will British people say about the Britain of 2026? But this is a silly question, since historians will not recognise this place today as Britain. Future historians will probably not talk about Britain in 2026 because they will be thinking about a thing which by then will be dead, and was already dead by the year 2026. As a whole, those who used to be known as the British are no longer reproducing enough. That's statistically proven. This has nothing to do with poverty or any physical conditions. It's a spiritual disease among men and women. They are aimless. They have a philosophical problem, and they don't live properly because they believe false things. My approach has been to show that their spiritless individualism, in which they alone can be said to believe, has a root in the past and is something that is right. It is right for British people to be entirely self-centred and individualistic, but I do demand of anyone that they consider their liberal individualism to be rooted finally and first and last in the spiritual commands of God. That's why, in order to save the people from embarrassment, I've embraced and explained liberalism in this book. I've said that it is right, it's proper to be an individual. But what individualism used to mean, and what it still means, is that you should be free to experience God as you choose. And because you and the church are separate from the government, then the government will keep a great distance from your life as an individual. That is, it also means that the state government should back away. There's no question, but the law of God demands that a man has a family, and that the state should not interfere in his private life or his family. A man is the master of his own house, but as we know, the state now, I have seen in these times, is a mammoth or a leviathan, and considers itself wiser than the man in his own house. It has told us that our liberal freedom will be guaranteed by total state supervision of the free individual. A paradox, a contradiction, a lie. In a liberal British world, the state must never have been allowed to think itself wise enough to govern the individual's life. The state is not even an individual itself, it's a mere organisation, a set of employees. The state, which now interferes in what you think and tells you what is right and wrong on politics, in the law, it should not be doing this because it is no better than a committee. A traffic attendant has as much right to lay down the law on how a man lives his life as the state does. There is reason for this growing ambition of the government to put men in prison and ban them from political life because of their political beliefs. It's the same reason that the state is now inevitably most interested in taking gross, disgusting amounts of money as tax from individuals and then getting involved in the man's family life, paying him, paying his enemies, paying for all kinds of wasteful and anti-liberal things. The reason is this. The state government in Westminster has taken over where the church used to be. The state, since 1914, has offered protection, redemption, meaning and justice to the people and to the individual. It currently takes more than 45% of the nation's money and then distributes it around to faithful and servile people. As a rule, it also denies protection and advancement to anyone who is not obedient to it. It has also taken our money so as to pay for foreigners to arrive in limitless numbers to replace the British, almost as an afterthought, as something which was easy and natural. The government and the state itself is, in short, as rotten, as powerful and as deserving of destruction as the Catholic Church was at the time of the Reformation. It is time for this form of the liberal state to be unplugged, just as the Church of Rome was unplugged in the 1530s. What would it mean to destroy the state? Should anyone feel any regret or fear when contemplating shutting down Westminster, the House of Commons, the Lords, and the Civil Service, and everything else associated with those places? The British Constitution has an ancestry to some extent the Protestant English Puritans, who made up the larger part of the people 350 years ago, following the Reformation, compromised with the equally post-Reformation aristocratic class, when they demanded this, that if they could not have a universal Presbyterian church, then the state, in the form of Parliament, must replace that church piece by piece. It would become a religious state. These two post-Reformation governing elites, the Puritans and the aristocratic merchants, have governed Britain for between 300 and 500 years ever since, and have finally replaced the church with the state. And the Puritan heart has therefore invented and assented to the atheist, progressive, socialist and liberal democratic state with which we are now familiar and living in as in a nightmare. That this was the new role of the Commons to bring about an infiltration into the lives of the people, as if it were the case that the new government is but old bishop writ large. It was openly theorised in the mid-19th century that the individual would fade away for the happiness of the greatest number, for social democratic reform, for progress in morals to be overseen by the political class. These were the theories of the 19th century English thinkers, such as George Eliot, John Stuart Mill maybe. And the church would make way for a kind of extreme communism, for a progressive improvement of morals encouraged by the government. This became the English religion. At least, that is what the busiest of the British people thought at the time. Now I'm asking, can there be a return of God? I've said that the nation needs to return to God, and so I'm interested in the nuts and bolts of explaining why there should be no doubt in the mind of any individual that they should turn to God. Only individuals believe in God. It's not something you can subcontract. You can't subcontract it out to the state, for instance. In this century, this year, it feels as if the progressive democracy has reached as far as it can go before it reaches an implosion and death. There are no ideas. There's no leadership. These are indications of the end of the road for the organisation. Even the revolutionaries who want a new kind of reformation have no better ideas than to turn back to a better time, let's say 30 years ago. They say, 30 years ago things were fine. I can't see how anyone has ever been able to turn back a single life 30 years. To think it is possible that an entire nation should do so is simply mad. There is no going back in time. Besides, I recall how it was 30 years ago, and that the nation at that time was so aimless and without principle is the reason why it was so easy and to see it so quickly destroyed. There's no sense in thinking about how things used to be. But I do draw the line about the past and how things used to be, and how I say that it can be revived in this way only. When we examine the old nation of Rome, that polity began as a monarchy, and after 500 years of civil development, the Republic of Rome reverted back to being a monarchy, where it remained for another 500 years before it was replaced by the Gothic kingdoms. I would say that our nation, too, began in a certain way, namely to be ruled by a church, which was protected by a monarch. I think that this is how the past will return to Britain. I suppose it would be right to say that we are going to turn the clock back something like 500 years in how we understand and live out our existences as individuals. What should lead is the individual. The individual should be in charge. The individual alone matters. And what I mean by that is that the spirit of Christianity demands that each man look after himself and his eternal soul. I mean that in community with one another, each individual is part of the church, and that each one must be protected in law and war by a single individual in the person of a king. I will come to what I mean by this later. The situation is so dreadful today, and likely to grow so much worse, that such a revolution as the arrival of the church and the rise of a despotic individual is inevitable. Before anyone comments that Britain is part of Europe now, I would point out that this is also going to happen in the European nations, since they are in the same position as ourselves. I've come to this conclusion that, and it remains to justify this, and to make it philosophically something that people can consent to, for their own good, and because it is necessary. To show the dire situation we are in, I asked whether, and why, if the nation were faced with the same sort of world as it was in 1939, whether and why the people would fight and try to win a war against their enemies. I pointed out that the leading thinkers of that time gave reasons why the people wanted to win and to defend Britain 90 years ago. I referred to Orwell, T.S. Eliot, Friedrich Hayek and others who explained why the British fought for their nation. Nobody at that time ever said that Britain was fighting for democracy. Democracy is not what the war was about. Every nation in Europe at that time claimed it was a democracy and that it had popular consent and legitimacy. And the war was not fought for democracy. If we were to get rid of it today in its current form, it would not matter to those who really count. It would not matter to the individual, because the individual does not benefit from democracy. As things stand, the individual has no benefit from it, and it would be a blessing to see it put aside. Democracy seems to be another name for government by international market. Nobody should be sad to see it go. It is a hindrance to the necessary change. Today, men would not even fight such a war at all. I think it's commonly understood. Because whatever it was that Eliot, Orwell, Hayek and the rest at that time said mattered no longer exists. I believe that men of Britain would fight for the country as little as the women of Britain today choose to give birth. It appears to me that the entire people as a culture are as if in a novel by Michel Houellebecq, and that they have simply given up the past and the future. Their lack of philosophy is so grave that they don't see any point in doing anything for or against the nation and the state. They enjoy their lives and live it in a curated way. The nation is a thing of the past, and they know it. Their own elite, their government, have made it a thing of the past, and it is right to say that, despite Orwell, Eliot, Hayek and the rest, the men of Britain fought the Germans in those years on behalf of Britain and because they were British people. There was no other reason, and that reason is now gone. And as in Welbeck, it's clear that what has changed is that we have no nation because one way or another we have destroyed our religion and the religious means of finding a direction. The loss of our country was a mere effect of that terrifying failure. It was a result of the disappearance of any individual relation to God. Our religion was what made us who we were. It is what built our country and made us invincible in Europe and the world. It was liberal in the classical sense. It was a church outside the state. It was private. It was the basis of our individualism and the sovereignty of the individual. Every man was each a single person in Christ, and all the laws, the politics, the trade, the invention, the entire culture derived from that principle. For the most fundamental meaning of the gospel is this, that each man must individually relate himself to God and his eternal soul. I've entitled this next section, How to Make People Go to Church. The church is the origin and meaning of liberalism too. And this culture of the individual needs a church, first of all, and only secondarily a state. If I knew how to make other people care about God again, I would do it, but I don't know. Besides, the Orthodox Church, which I think God approves of for us, does not spread the word. Orthodoxy simply asks you to attend, to make yourself present, and to get involved. So I can't convince anyone to follow God, let alone the entire nation. I can't make them attend and be ready. In the Gospel of John it is said that you must be reborn in the Spirit. Be born again in spirit and not in flesh. In Orthodoxy, one is not born again because it is expected that you were born into the existing church already. But in England there is no church of this kind, and although men must be born again in spirit if they are to survive in this world, let alone the next, I don't know how to converse them to be born again. The Orthodox don't evangelize, because the message of selfhood and silence is spread by people just going to church and being there. It's not spread with words. You don't talk about silence. One is not reborn, rather one is already born in the spirit of orthodoxy. One is already born in the spirit in orthodoxy. So there's no need to spread the word and to speak in tongues or to become enthusiastic. And I can't do it, though I wish I could. What the people require of a leader, out of the death of their nation, is a representative from God. And for such guidance to emerge, they need a king or a dictator in modern parlance. What stands in the way is the massive communistic progressive state. It stands in the way of the religion and the dictator. Only an arbitrary dictatorship by a nationalistic king could destroy that state and prevent the subsequent chaos. If Britain had a dictator who removed the state and reformed it from Christians of the proper type, the entire nation would follow, and it would survive for another 500 years. Would such a dictator oppose or be antithetical to centuries of English development? I do not think so. In the example of Oliver Cromwell and the kings who went before him, there is plenty of justification for a new reformation, which would be typical of the English in this way. He must be, or will be, a dictator, I add, who rolls back the state almost to zero. There will be no welfare distribution, no taxes, no interference, no salvation by the mob, for the mob, by the mob. Democracy, which the professional class of politician implicitly believes in and constantly claims that people have died for, has in fact never had any martyrs. The people who would lament the destruction of the state would be its beneficiaries, true, who are parasites. And also it would be lamented by those who run the state, namely the progressive functionaries, the judges, the politicians, media employees, civil servants, and so on. But I have also no interest in large corporate international capitalism. What tax the king should raise would be used to police and terrorize big international businesses, rather than let them carry on as normal. Indeed, what is big international business but the accomplice of the state? The state these days manages and encourages large multinational operations. That is what the people need to be protected against. In 2008, there was a collapse of the financial systems of London and New York. It was not global, but British and American. It was not a global financial collapse, it was local. At that time, the chief industries of those nations collapsed because they were corrupt and they needed to be shut down. However, the state government, run by Gordon Brown at the time, and the federal government in the United States did not allow those corrupt industries to die, but rather infused them with fake money, printed money, so as to maintain them. This exemplifies one of the harmful activities of the contemporary state in Britain and justifies our removing it from the country. By printing the money, any productive savings or property which the British people had were lost because of inflation. And in the long run, the excess money was not invested into the wider economy so that we could see the inflation. Rather, it was invested into the housing stock, the housing supply, so that we only noticed the rise in the value, in the rise of prices in the housing. Basically, to save the banks, the people who need to live somewhere, namely the young, could no longer afford to buy and live in their own country. Buy houses and live in their own country. Industries like this, and I mean the financial sector, will have to go. Britain's banks were mostly formed after the Glorious Revolution of 1689, and the origins of those banks and associated services go back as far as the Reformation, when the church lands were given to aristocrats, having been stolen from the church. And those aristocrats formed the Whig Party in later times. And they turned their assets, dishonestly gained in that way, into trade and investment, for which banks were needed. In 2008, which is 300 and something years later, that entire system shook and collapsed after perhaps 300 years of successful work. Since then, the banking investment sector, particularly in the United States, has gone on doing the same work. And when we look around at our actual country, we see what you might call the desert of the real. In theory, Britain and the United States, following the bailout of those huge banks, which collapsed because they were corrupt, Britain and the United States, in theory, are industrious, wealthy nations, desirable places to live. But when one looks at these places and what they are actually like, we see that they are falling apart. This is because there is no productivity, where the chief industry is banking and insurance and money services. The economies of those countries are booming, in theory, while the people's share of that income has been static for nearly 20 years. Share trading goes on as a vast enterprise, inflating the currency more and more daily. The value of the leading companies keeps on increasing. And as those share prices rise, the money supply increases, and the GDP seems to grow. But the people receive less and less. Fewer people work because they cannot be paid enough. And therefore, the lived environment in the real world in our countries becomes more like a desert every day. Basic maintenance is done, but the only reason why, let us say, London is still inhabitable at all is because of the labour done by previous generations of men who produced the buildings, the water supply, the road and the rail systems, the power stations, while there is barely enough real money to maintain them. And this is due to the existence of the banking system, with its ability to generate fiat money because of the protection of the state. And this is authorised and encouraged by the state. Let's be clear. As the Prime Minister would say, let me be very clear, it has to go. In this age, practical democracy is of no use when the people who are part of it are not already an ethnically monotype, racially pure people who care implicitly for each other and their shared inheritance. As Aristotle has said, and as was obvious in Britain for the last 300 or 400 years, our democracy works because we are a racially pure people, implicitly caring for each other and having a shared inheritance and a shared interest in the future. Paradoxically, this racial politics on which democracy depends is the most pure precondition of democracy and also the precondition for the National Socialists. National Socialist and Fascist states have the almost unanimous consent of the people because they are it is a pure ethnic rule for a people and by a people. The ethnically distinct group sees their advantage, votes for it, and gets their representative. Now, democracy can't work today, even if we wanted it to, even in a benign or pacifist form, the antithesis of National Socialism. Democracy could not work, because the people who live in Britain and have the right to vote now are not a people anymore. They are in large part mere economic migrants. And I do not exclude from that definition the natives themselves. The native indigenous are these days considered to be, by the government and by themselves, mere economic migrants. And that is how they have fallen into seeing themselves. This is all to say, democracy is no longer possible in this country, even if we wanted to keep it. I advise the revolutionary destruction of Parliament and the Constitution in favour of a dictator who ensures only this: freedom of the self from trouble by others under law, justice and protection of rights and property, and national identity organised by military power against our external enemies. It is a medieval settlement of the state, and with the separation of church and state it would mean that the church must be culturally dominant, as the educator in British liberalism and adherence to Christ and spiritual freedom. Once this meaning of life is made plain, and it is a philosophical understanding of who we are, and once the means to understand it are explained in the silence of simple worship and prayer, people will do it. Not to be too cynical about things, but if they have no choice but to believe, then they will do so. And in the actual absence of any other ideas or beliefs, which is how we find ourselves, they will have no choice. Besides which, I would add on a side note, people imitate their betters. And when the government is Christian, the people will be Christian. And I cannot see any theological objection that could be made to this. When I talk about liberalism, I mean John Locke's perfectly English type of liberalism. Locke, the English philosopher and Christian, is in every way aware of the individual as the primary unit of meaning, the only true substance, the central consciousness, the unquestioned origin of the world. The origin of the world, but not the origin of creation, obviously. Humans live in a world which is suitable to themselves, and we make our world but with our imagination and our perception of it. Our consciousness shapes our world, and then we get involved in and create the world for ourselves. The individual is the centre of that activity. There are no two individuals. There is only ever one with which we are familiar, which we can experience. The individual is not selfish or self-obsessed, properly understood. He's the centre of creation. He is as a Christian, the Son of God. And without him, there is no world, and there's no point in there being a world anyway. He is in possession of the only real thing in all existence, namely consciousness and unity of self. In his actions, he is not careless and taking his own way. He's taking God's way. And he's doing the commands of the scriptures and nature. He follows the law which the prophets laid down forever. Family, nation, neighbours, freedom from enemies are what the law commands of him. That is what true liberalism means also. It means that the individual considers himself an eternal soul. Others too have an eternal soul which belongs to God and not to the state. The true liberal and Christian and British man does not even belong to himself. He belongs to his Maker. And that is why he is free and sovereign. This is the ground of morality. All men are equal in the eyes of God, as created by God. And in this way, we make way for God in what you could call an authentic selfishness. Christianity is not a license to break the law and then to be forgiven. Unlike the modern justice system of this country, Christianity never says that a man sins because of his environment. It does not forgive crime. As little does it allow a man to seek charity from others. Our religion is certainly not an opportunity for the buttressing of our grotesquely massive British welfare system. It is not a reason to intervene and to force people to be equal either. Christianity is not the reason why we have to submit to taxation, to welfare handouts, to inaction before crime, or tolerance of Islam. Tolerance of Islam. The modern Church of England and their bishops have so far forgotten the law of the scriptures that they insist on tolerance of Islam, as well as other lawless and anti-spiritual things of the same stamp. We've had a look at how it was possible for Milton and Cromwell to be both Christian and also at the centre of civil and imperial war. And in this way it has been possible to understand how Christian people should view their nation, and how they should understand the law at play in the Old and New Testaments as it governs war and national defence and the treatment of people who are the enemies of our country. Men are never equal to each other. Only in eternity and in the soul is it so that men are equal. But in nature they are never equal, and they never will be. In their wealth, their minds, their bodies, they are different, and they are not the same, so they cannot be equal. Some live in one land and are not permitted to enter other lands. Some are more wealthy than others, and it's the job of the state to ensure that thieves and the envious are prevented from casting doubt on these principles. Only in the eternal soul are individuals equal before God. But that some things are better than others is simply obvious. It took the massive, progressive and tyrannical British state to say otherwise, and to lie and to impose the lie everywhere, with legislation if possible. And it has got to go, for this reason alone if necessary. Of course I'm referring to the recent DEI legislation, but it goes back to the legislation on race in the 1960s, and even further back into universal education and welfare and so on, the regimentation of people into the same. The British state has opened its borders to countless foreigners on the assumption that we are all equal, and that the inimical foreigner is equally entitled to live here in our country. He is an economic migrant, a cultural nomad of the human race, as we are, the state has said. What a filthy crime it has been, This miserable misreading of what men are has led to the extinction of Britain in their minds, and I'm convinced it has wiped out our national individuality, our identity as a nation. The nation chose to remove itself from history and to have no future. The genesis of this madness was in 1914 perhaps, when Britain needlessly fought Germany, and then again in 1945 when the men were so shell-shocked and dead from war that the British people thought it would be a good idea to melt all nations into one another. And Britain has melted into the EU and into the global nowhere by policy. The contemporary politician of every party is simply carrying on this post-war sickness, this war-weary, world-weary, value-free atheism, this progress, which means that boat migrants swamp us, Indians and Africans overwhelm us, things which are done in the spirit of listless and uneducated belief that it is God's will to do this, and that it's quite Christian that this should happen. But why should an individual choose to care for his nation? Logically, an isolated individual should only care about himself. He is intrinsically alone in his consciousness, and he is alone saved by Christ, so why shouldn't he live alone? Why should I care about Britain's death? But as well as being the individual, I'm also human, and I need a place to live. I can't steal from others, and a man has to honour his parents and his ancestors. Your ancestors didn't want you to live like a beggar, or to open wide your doors to squatters from everywhere, to live in a desert. This has all made our home into a nowhere. You should not have to become a nomad as the invaders are. Was Abraham offered a homeland? Was Moses offered a release for his people from slavery? How can a Christian do right when he is surrounded by enemies and strangers who hate his beliefs and don't even speak the same language as him? Men must have a nation if they are to obey God's laws. Contemporary Christian thinkers, who are internationalists to a man, they are the ones who are in the English Church's hierarchy. These contemporary Christians would not be in a job if they were to follow the scriptures for real, with Moses and Isaiah, as the Christians should. These contemporary Christians are no better than David Icke, who took something spiritual such as the devil and said that the devil is an actual person. Icke said that the spiritual truth of the existence of evil should be taken literally, so that one must believe, he says, that there is a set of elite reptile, alien, supernatural and demonic lizards with shape-shifting skills, living in plain sight, because if there is evil, there must be evil things. And so he invented these alien interdimensional lizards. He reified the spiritual into something pedestrian and everyday. And this is what happens if you interpret the Gospels literally too. For literalists, the devil must be assumed to have an actual body, and he must be ruling the country literally, as if to say that Keir Starmer is a shape-shifting reptile, just as Damien in the Omen film is the devil as a human being. The contemporary Christian of the Church of England has done the same with Christ. These people took the Son of God, the spiritual capstone and the teachings of the Old Testament, and they made the spirituality of Christ's mission and meaning into the obscene worship of failure and death. They made the point of life to be that you should suffer and that your enemies crucify you. They made each Christian into a creditor's beggar who has literally given away his coat, someone who must turn his actual face toward those who hate him if they want to beat it for him. This contemporary Christian is obliged to go on long pointless journeys of miles to help the lazy and the evil, and not just a mile, but as many miles as are required of him by people who hate him. The contemporary English church is anathema to anyone who believes in spiritual and eternal life. It is the ruin of the spirit, as the contemporary democratic government is the ruin of the nation. What we see in the last moments of Britain, in which we are living, is the progressive socialism of the post-Christians. But I say that the individual must be everything in an absolute and eternal self-interestedness. And the country must be run in the same way as a monarchy, by a harsh and, I would say, a biblical despotism. The lasting English way of living is, under Christ, a spiritual athleticism and individualism, with an individual ruler who must have no job at all except to protect the people from their cultural enemies and protect their inheritance from strangers and thieves, visitors who have impolitely arrived and stayed for too long. And the sickness of atheist progressive socialism and internationalism has gone too far, so far that only a dictator could rid us of it. This curse. I now turn to the self and the battlefield of the self as it's understood. Because that the self even exists is something contested. The denial of the self goes hand in hand with the denial of Christianity and God, because one comes from the other. I have something to say about the unit of value, the real substance, the only really existing thing, namely the self and the individual consciousness. Understanding what an individual is plays its part in showing what following Christ and Christianity is. When it comes to the highest spirituality and the most refined understanding of the human consciousness, it is not, as Spinoza thought, that at higher levels of refinement the individual dissolves into one universal and impersonal mind. Spinoza speculated that if he looks at himself properly, then a man must realize that his mind is not his own but God's, and that there are no other minds at all. This logically constructed anti-spiritual philosophy has attracted many people of a socialistic inclination. I disagree with it. What is truer to say is that there is indeed one mind, but it is not the mind of everyone. Rather, it is the unique selfhood and consciousness of the person who matters most, and almost everywhere and always to the exclusion of everyone else. I mean the individual. I do not deny that God's mind should be the destination of our mind, and at the highest point they are the same, but, truly, the individual remains the individual, and he does not turn into the crowd, the mass. He does not dissolve himself into some kind of atheistic universal mind. Spinoza's philosophy is demonic and only provable by logic, but not by experience. It will be doubted by people of a scientific and selfless, objective mind that we have always been individualists and Christians. They would doubt that. But right or wrong, we've been individualists in England forever. It's our chthonic culture. You can see this in John Locke, the proper English spirit, in his account of what can be known when he says, pass him in his essay on a human understanding, that we are sceptical about knowing anything other than our own mind. He says that one only ever knows even the most simple thing in a partial way, and above all in a personal way. In what could be thought of as a sad failure of human being to take itself seriously, the ideas which the scientist has about reality are as private and incommunicable as the ideas of an idiot. And I'm now going to talk about science for a short time, because it has been thought to have pushed religion out of our culture. And I make this point to anyone who wants to evade his responsibility to God and to himself. He might tell me that science, with a capital S, that science is an impersonal consensus institution, has disproven God's existence. But nobody is going to evade their responsibility to be a Christian because of science. It's improper to think that you can forget about yourself or God because of Darwin or Newton or those who discovered DNA. Science, like society, as Margaret Thatcher said, only exists in the imagination, and that science does not exist. Because what is real about it alone is the individual men who have discovered technical aspects of reality and who have shared those aspects and ideas, with more or less success, with others. There are only individuals in science. Science is in fact, properly understood, the work of the individual, and has no greater authority than that. The position we find ourselves in life is that no one individual knows anything at all absolutely, and no two people ever think or experience the same thing ever. Now, this undermines the entire basis of what they call science with a capital S, because science is supposed to be an impersonal thing believed by everybody or shared by everybody. But such a thing, as Locke points out, is impossible. Only the individual ever knows, because only the individual has a mind and an understanding. Locke writes in his essay of the late 1600s that knowledge is something which, in the first place, is known always by the individual, because intrinsically we cannot ever see even the most simple of things in itself and as it really is. And men always disagree about the nature of things in themselves, something which you can prove empirically by noticing that they have different ideas about the exact same thing, which proves that we do not know the things in themselves, and nobody experiences what his neighbour experiences. You would be lucky to find even two people agreeing on the same thing, never mind having something called science about which everyone agrees. When any two individuals claim to have known the thing in itself, then when those same two men have different views on what it is, and have had different experiences of it as they inevitably do, then we see the problem. We effectively only know partially, and what each individual knows, whether he is a scientist of genius, or whether he's an artist, or whether he's the most simple-minded of the faithful, is as good as knowing the absolute as you will ever get. So, in the age of Newton, Locke still insisted that things in themselves, or what he called substances, were unknown. He would not have considered that DNA explains what men are. DNA and the theory of evolution have not revealed the truth of man or nature any more than Michelangelo or Genesis did. Nor has atomic theory given a full and comprehensive account of what gold is. If Locke had known about the periodic table, he would have added it to a list of other qualities of metals and gold, just alongside all of the others which he did know about, such as its colour, its fusibility, its weight, and so on. And just so, the Earth has not been sufficiently described either by Newtonian physics or by any accurate guess about how old it is or how it evolved. These things are not the entire story, and we have been made in such a way that we shall never know the real nature of the Earth as a planet. Studies of the human brain and other modern heresies are not only inadequate to explain human selfhood, but they have been used to atheistically manipulate simple-minded people into being lazy about their responsibility toward their soul. Certainly, brain studies and the like are things which can be useful in the technological field of medicine. But as descriptions of reality in itself, accounts of what a man's personality is, for instance, as accounts of what human being is, those sciences fail. The important questions are not addressed by technology. See how, if one were to ask contemporary science what a man is, and one were to be told that he is the result of DNA or evolution, then one would have to imagine these invisible DNAs and this distant prehistory. And it would not help one to understand men at all, or barely. I mean to say, we live in such a way that such knowledge is largely useless to us and irrelevant, and this will always be the case. I make a side note. When one reads the essay of Locke, he finds it strange that he makes his entire essay is structured around the point that he is alone in the world trying to find out and explain to his contemporaries what knowledge is. And this is like a very extremely honest account of the situation that anyone finds himself in. And that the ideas supplied by something along the lines of Newtonian physics are very, very interesting to him. He didn't deny that Newton, along with the other astronomers, had made great advances in technical knowledge. But he still continued to insist that even with the most simple objects, we cannot see what they really are. Now imagine trying to understand what a man really is. It's impossible. And I cannot, speaking from my personal opinion, I do not think that the theory of DNA, as it currently stands or will ever stand, brings any value to my knowledge of who I am, or anybody else. And I think that everyone else lives the same. We don't consider DNA and evolution and so on when we are dealing with other people. These are they're interesting bits of knowledge about material reality, for sure. I don't deny that. And they can be technically useful. The account of the survival of the fittest and evolution surrounding the name of Charles Darwin would not have been of any great interest to Locke as an explanation of the actual nature of existing things in their real substance, because he denied that we could know that. I do not doubt that what is technologically useful to us in medicine, genetics and evolution is as true as engineering techniques ever can be. But as knowledge of reality, these things are not essential. Most people don't understand them, and everyone lives oblivious to them. Nobody has ever seen DNA, nobody has ever understood how evolution might apply to them personally, and so on. Men see and know a human or animal body. They do not know a pack of invisible DNA. They have only, at best, a theoretical understanding of natural selection, and never a practical understanding of it. And these sorts of knowledge never directly affect anybody. Science is a technical way of dealing with being, and leaves the field of conscious subjectivity entirely untouched and indifferent. And therefore the relationship between God and man remains what it always has been, and always will be. To my mind, it's a hoax perpetrated on the English people when it is said to mostly uneducated individuals that science has replaced worship and faith in God. The hoax has had worse and worse consequences as the years have passed. I do not mean by this any kind of relativism. I am not saying that a scientist sees nature in one way, but I may see it in the way that I prefer. That I may see it as I choose and shut my eyes to medical technology. That's not what I'm saying. Rather, we should insist that all that we know, all that we have knowledge of, is ideas. And the ideas are put together in one way or another, but that we shall never know the thing in itself. The actual structure of our world and life is hidden from us, and that is why Christ's mission, which does answer that question about who we are and what man is, has no problem with the theories of Darwin or of anyone else. The only thing anyone truly knows is his own consciousness, his own unity and continuous existence as a soul. Nothing else can be known absolutely. Indeed, compared to this overwhelming fact of being alive, hardly anything else matters at all to anybody. People spend their lives relating to themselves, looking after themselves for good or ill, and the Son of God is only interested in that too. What Christ means, what the true life is the self and consciousness, which are the true thing in itself. The true substance, and something which can be known directly. There's no soft socialistic morality in Christ either. The spiritual law which God sent with Christ is not about other people. It's about you. He was not interested by and large in telling people how to live as a herd. The scriptures had already laid out the law, and only in some basic instructions about how to build a church were left to us by him about how to interact with other people. By and large, other people are also irrelevant to the Christian. When he said that you must love your enemies, and that you should have no desire to molest other people, and that you should have no possessions, so that you should give away your stuff to the poor, these were instructions to a man who sets out to pray and put himself in front of God. They are instructions for you to focus intently on your unique individuality. They are not direct instructions that you should take literally about how to act like a holy fool. They are instructions about how to grow in the Spirit. They are instructions on how to pray constantly so as to become an individual and to have faith. To have faith is to have no enemies. In spirit, eternally, you have no enemies. But in life, in the flesh, our nation certainly has enemies. It has them in the flesh, in its rulers. And you have enemies in anyone who has an anti-British ideology, by virtue of the logical fact that such people are anti-British, and they belong to some other country or nation. In the everyday world, Christians have many enemies, and to love and encourage them is not right. Those who love and encourage their enemies are no better than Antichrist. Prayer is the revelation of the self, and the revelation of God in the self. And that is why it is important to me, and that is how one must interpret the Gospels. I make a final subchapter now on William James and his critique of the self. I say the critique of the self. James was a psychologist who examined individuality and his own self, and what he has said has some interest. It might be said that I am looking at objections to my thesis. In his classic work on psychology, William James examined himself introspectively to find out what the human person or self, or what the soul, is. Conveniently for me, James put together a succinct statement about why you could say that selfhood and the soul can't be real. As we know, I say that selfhood and the soul are real and are the ultimate and absolute reality. The soul, in my opinion, is the one substance which it is possible to know with almost total certainty, and it is the reason that God became man. I can clarify what I mean by the self, and also allay any doubts about it, if I make a short discussion of James's view on this matter. In his Principles of Psychology of 1890, he has not set out to do some kind of atheistic destruction of Christianity. That would be impossible, even for a great mind such as his, if one were being scrupulous and honest about what Christianity means. Christianity cannot be destroyed in that way. James has, rather, on the basis of what he understands the soul and the self to be, said that he doesn't understand how they can be immortal, or even how they can truly exist as they are supposed to do. He has rightly hit upon the notion that the self is something required by Christianity, and that Christianity is all about the individual soul, and that the immortality of the soul is its most dominant characteristic. By looking at himself and his experiences, James concluded that being a self seems to be no more than a matter of personal choice. And as a scientist, he was cautious about giving credence to it, because something which is discretionary and which you have to create cannot be an object of science. What one calls me, he said, is not so much a destiny and a given and like an eternal soul, not so much that as something that one chooses to be. As an example, you could try to be a certain kind of man, a good man by your own lights, yet at the same time constantly find yourself being somebody else, and doing the wrong thing instead of the good, and against your own wishes. So, What or who you actually are is not something one understands, and talk about being a self does not describe what is going on. When somebody is alive, we could say, is this the activity of a self, or is it something else? It might be more proper to say that there are a dozen selves all working at the same time in one person. James said that he could countenance the notion of a principle of individuality, by which he means a soul which is immaterial, personal, and eternal. But, he said, this immaterial individual selfhood is not the thing with which we are familiar in our everyday life. The thing which he could imagine is eternal in us is not the thing that acts from day to day. The everyday self is largely an absent-minded, world-engrossed person, so one is right to ask, if my eternal immaterial self is distinct from the everyday self, which I am for most of the time, then which part of me will live forever? And will it still be me if I am stripped of the characteristics which make me different from other people, the characteristics which I see and experience every day? If he loses those parts, which surely cannot be eternal, then is he the same person in heaven as he was when he was on earth? What part of me actually survives death as something pure and immaterial? He asked. He was also attentive to how he experienced emotions, and how much part of his soul or self the body seems to play in these things. It would be possible to say that when a man feels love, for instance, it's his body or his heart which provokes that emotion. His body first of all feels the attraction, and then his heart starts to beat, and finally he says he feels in love. It's his body which trembles with passion and hurt, and precedes the uncontrollable throes of conscious emotional anger, as another example. And it's the body and things which one cannot control which make one shiver with fear, before or as the cause of the emotional feeling and consciousness of fear. James made these observations after having looked at himself, and so as to cast doubt on the notion that the mind survives death, or that it leaves all emotion behind. Because the mind which casts aside the body and casts aside the emotions dependent on it is largely who we are. And he thought it would be that the immaterial soul would therefore lose most of what it is after death. And it seems improper to slice a person up in this way, he said, since the self apparently is the body. So the self which just goes to the afterlife would have to be seriously reduced in order for it to have immortality and to be immaterial. If one does not take the body into the next life, then the self does not go there either. So James has 4 objections to the thought that the human being is immortal, or in more drastic terms, objections to the idea that there is a self at all. Firstly, he objects that the will seems to be mostly involuntary, and people do things for the most part without even thinking. So if a person is the will, his own will, he's not in control of it, so it's not his. Therefore, who owns the will? Is the self in command of itself? Secondly, he made the point that the self seems to be created, curated, trained, and developed, rather than having been given by God, if it exists at all. And thirdly, he said that what a man or a self is conscious of is usually or always accompanied by a large amount of unconscious knowledge and desire or will, which should lead us to wonder whether a self is not responsible or not even aware of what or who he is, by and large. If the self is both conscious and unconscious, then wouldn't it also be a drastic change in selfhood to deny the unconscious parts of it? Finally, as we've already remarked, the body plays a great part in defining what the self is, supplying it with its emotions and its responses to its environment. It is to these astute and honest questions and doubts that I think that prayer and meditation are the answer. I would say that we shall have to accept that the individual self is attached to the body, and that the body is the chief reason why we know for sure that the self is real and substantial. I would say that having a self is something proven by having a body, and that after death the body must be resurrected along with the self and the consciousness. I cannot see how this is anywhere denied in the Gospels either, or by the tradition or the Church. I suppose I'm saying that if we're going to talk about selfhood and individuality, then we cannot, and in the same breath, the immortality of the soul, then what we call the body must also be immortal or resurrected. And further, what else is the teaching of Christ but this, that you will look after your eternal soul, and by prayer come to know your subconscious, and above all, become familiar with the immortal part of yourself? I think James has said that the way that he lives his normal life, the kind of person that he is not the kind of person that is the immaterial, eternal soul. But I would say that this is exactly what prayer is all about. It is about becoming familiar with your immaterial, immortal soul, whilst integrating it with your body, so as to become healthy and what they call free of sin. Not that I'm going to go into a long discourse about how precisely the practice of prayer is the answer to James's objections, but that is what I think. And I also think that Christ's life on earth had this purpose, namely to encourage you to turn to the Holy Spirit and to cultivate it with prayer. I cannot easily put into words how much of a revolution it must cause in philosophy if those who ask and answer its questions are first obliged to do prayer in this practical way, as James did not. It caused a revolution in my life, and it ought to cause one in the history of philosophy. It's ironic that James was one of the first and remains one of the few who studied Eastern philosophy and meditation while writing in the tradition of British philosophy at the same time. It's ironic that he did so because he also refused to practice meditation himself, or to notice that it is at the heart of the tradition of Christian orthodoxy, and that it would have answered his doubts. The irony lies in the fact that he's one of the few who could have done these things, but he didn't. Nevertheless, his objections and doubts deserve to be looked at, as they are expressed in his Principles of Psychology, because they are the doubts of a man who has refused to do what he must and work with the Spirit. You must do the prayer until, and so as, the person you are familiar with every day is the one which is worth saving after death. Pray until you are at most times familiar with the eternal self. Work at it, and if you want to put it in these terms, you must create the self. It should be the kind of silent selfhood, integrated and open to the creation and life, which is also in constant communication with the Holy Spirit. I do not find that this is a hard thing to do. In my experience, it's not only easy, but also what I would refer to as a release from suffering and selfhood and false selfhood, and from a bad life. It is, as David Lynch said of meditation, money in the bank. I have a couple of things to say in conclusion. People could object to me that God would not have made the world like this. I mean, a world where children suffer, where people die, where we are ignorant and stupid for the most part, and where there is strife and suffering in general, where you could say Christians are forced to look after a nation, and where the war would be against their own neighbours if it were a civil war. They would say this as a rejection of the idea that God is. But I say, look at yourself and your life, not at the lives of others. You could say also, don't imagine civil wars because you haven't been part of one of them. You have not yet been part of one. You should pay attention to what you actually have done and where you are. In the same sense, I would say, you should not be considering the suffering of children or people who die young, because these are events in your life. They are not your life. If you are aware of the suffering in other people and pity them, and then you deny that God is because of someone else's suffering, you are making a mistake. You have not been paying attention to yourself. You should not base your life on other people's lives. You should not derive your ideas from other people's experiences. I go so far as to say that you, who alone matter in this question, should not study to imitate or learn from the life of anyone, even from the life of Jesus, because doing so is the rise of a false consciousness and an inauthentic self. Each person is unique and eternal, and Christ taught you to be individual, and yet you continue to try to imitate somebody else. God gave his mind to man and breathed into him. He did not tell him to try to emulate other people, even to imitate the Son of God. Imitating Christ is a stupid and proud effort which has finished off the church in England in recent times, in my view, when they went so far as to put an anonymous and bureaucratic woman in command of their church because they thought it was kind to do so. Because Christ broke some commands of the Sabbath. Therefore, they said, I mean the Church of England, people said, it must be okay to break the commands of the Gospels and to put a woman at the head of the church. They thought they were imitating Christ by being kind. When writing of God, as I have done, one can only refer to one's own self, one's own life and experience. You must not speak objectively and in the third person about faith, since what others appear to be doing is not clear to you and is their own business, and can teach very little about what your obligations to God are in your personal life, your individual fate. Socialists, internationalists, and people of that misguided and somnolent type, they have chosen to be atheistic and to deny God because, they say, the world needs to be improved and only men can improve it. They've said that there is no place for God when there is a need to improve the lives of other people. That is the socialist creed. They ignore their self and claim to be doing good for others. Meanwhile, if one watches them, what they are actually doing, as if behind their own backs, is they use the state so as to attain power. They attain power and wealth, and they do so for other people. And that is the end that they are really seeking, when they dabble in other people's lives, when they live good protected lives by spending taxes. They collect tax, and they spend it on themselves for the most part. This is how they work for other people. That is the nature of Parliament, I think, these days. That is democracy. It is the devil. They end up as a mob of non-people, each of them thinking only of the other next person, if they think at all. They have turned the nation into a giant welfare trap, only fit to be governed and lived in as part of Europe, and each European nation is in the same situation of aimless progressive socialism, lacking any individuals of dignity, any individual among them with any self-worth, anyone with a mind of their own and a consciousness that they recognise. The only way such a controlled march to the sink and to the life of the gutter could work would be if all the other global nations followed the same folly, which, God has seen to it, they have not done. The only true path is the Christian one, the Christian in his individuality. I conclude my essay here. In the next part, which is the second part of my book, I intend to show how the dictator should rule this country and how he will make way for the Church and for the British people. I think that Britain has lost its way and is likely to move towards civil war. I have proposals to make about how it should be won, why it should be won, and what must come after. The future will see us back on the right path and out of this dark forest.